Greetings, Montana, and hello, world. It's Chris Hislop here again from the Montana World Affairs Council. We're in day 4 of International Careers Week. We have been bringing a veritable all-you-can-eat buffet of international expertise across a huge range of opportunities. This is all with a very specific purpose. As we work in classrooms and communities around Montana, we often hear, particularly from students, a very similar question that sounds like, how did you get the job that you do, and how can I do that job? So we have a lot of interest here in Montana on international careers to try to satisfy some of that curiosity. We've brought you now our 4th day of speakers. If you've missed any of our previous speakers, and there have been so many incredibly interesting people, all of those are available on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. So go back and have a look. You really don't want to miss it. And I'm glad you're here today because you don't want to miss a very special guest that I'm going to introduce. Before I do, special thanks to our very generous sponsors at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, First Interstate Bank, Trail West Bank, QFI, High Stakes Foundation, and Longview Foundation. They help us bring this and so many more programs to you all around this great state. Now, let me introduce our very special guest. Carol Spahn is a returned Peace Corps volunteer who served in Romania. She was sworn into office as the 21st director of the Peace Corps in December 2022. She comes to the Peace Corps headquarters with over 25 years of experience in international development, business, health, and women's empowerment. She served most recently as Chief Executive Officer and Acting Director of the Peace Corps. Previously, she served as Chief of Operations in the Africa region and as the Country Director of Peace Corps Malawi. From Senior Vice President of Operations at Women for Women International, serving marginalized women in conflict-affected countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, and DRC, to serving as Executive Director of Accordia Global Health Foundation, focused on creating sustainable health centers in Africa, Carol draws on a depth of knowledge and skill. Carol also worked at private sector institutions, including GE Capital and KPMG. Pete Marwick. Carol, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Well, not nearly as excited as we are. You probably know this factoid that here in Montana, particularly at the University of Montana in Missoula, we send a lot of people to the United States Peace Corps very proudly to serve this country in any number of very interesting places, doing very interesting things. You are a former Peace Corps volunteer. Many of our participants today are. I am a former Peace Corps volunteer. And so we would love to hear a little bit more from you, Carol, about your experience, maybe as a volunteer, but also as the director of Peace Corps, and all of this to help our participants, particularly our students, understand how the Peace Corps is an opportunity for them to launch into an international career. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. There's a lot I would love to share with this audience, and just really want to appreciate that you all are here and are tuned into global issues, having an interest in other people and cultures, and particularly following COVID, where I think we've all been in a space of increasing isolation from at the community level, at the national level, at the international level. So really, really great to see you all here. Want to commend you for your interest, and just wanted to share that when I grew up in Kansas, and when I was in high school and even during college, I really didn't expect that I would ever work abroad, let alone dedicate my career to international development and volunteerism. Rather, I came from a family that was very, very practical in the greatest way, and I studied accounting in college. So, how do you go from accounting to Peace Corps to being the director of the Peace Corps? I think that you heard in my bio, it's not a direct line. And you don't know when opportunities will present themselves. And you just have to be ready to say yes when those opportunities arrive. So it sounds like a lot of you may know something about Peace Corps, but I'll just share a little bit before getting into my story. So Peace Corps is a U.S. government agency. We were established 62 years ago now by President John F. Kennedy. And our most famous tagline and how most returned volunteers sort of associate their time with the Peace Corps is the toughest job you'll ever love, which is a fitting slogan for an agency with a mission as audacious as promoting world peace and friendship. Since 1961, we've had more than 241,000 Americans join the Peace Corps, and they've served in the far reaches of 143 countries around the world. So how does that work? Peace Corps volunteers must be U.S. citizens. They apply to be a volunteer, undergo a review process. They have to be cleared medically to be able to serve. And once they pass all of those steps, you're invited to serve in one of the more than 60 countries where we currently have operations. Most volunteers work with young people, and currently we have 6 sectors: so agriculture, community economic development, education, environment, health, and youth and development. I'd love to point out that volunteers range in age from 20 to 82, and they really represent the immense diversity of the United States. And we serve in countries where we're invited, and we work on projects that are of importance to the host government and to the communities where we serve. Most volunteer work assignments are for 2 years, although some technical assignments can be 3 months to 12 months. And we train volunteers, so we bring them into country. Many times they are living with host families at the community level for a period of 3 months. They learn technical skills, and they're expected to learn at least one of 177 different languages, which is really amazing. And they're expected to connect across difference, to share U.S. culture with their communities, and share whatever they learn about Senegal, Cambodia, Peru, or whatever culture they're immersed in right back home. So the fundamental premise of the Peace Corps is that we create world peace and friendship, one relationship at a time. We do that by living and working together. So what does this look like in practice? It's really a hard question to answer because every volunteer service is unique. What is the same is that volunteers' work does not revolve around necessarily bringing in large grants, lots of money, fancy materials. Instead, the volunteers work alongside community members and counterparts, and together they learn new skills, they try new ways of doing things. They have to be flexible, resourceful, and use the resources available in the community to make a difference. We send volunteers to teach, to work in rural health centers, to support aspiring entrepreneurs, to contribute to climate action, and so much more. Volunteers are given a meager monthly living allowance, similar to what their neighbors make, and this can be as little as $160 a month, but is enough to live on. Some volunteers' houses have running water and electricity, some have neither. Some live in cities, others 30 miles from a paved road. Some live with host families, some have their own apartments or huts. Some volunteers live in the coldest corners of the globe, and I know that Montana can get cold, but I just learned that volunteers in Mongolia, which is extremely cold, literally sleep with their vegetables at night to keep them from freezing, while others serve in the hottest places, and they might sleep outside with hammocks and mosquito nets in the hopes of catching even a slight breeze during 100-degree nights. We don't promise that anything will be easy. We don't guarantee results. It's a new language, a new culture, far from family and friends, low pay. Why would anyone in their right mind sign up for that and be so enthusiastic about their service even decades later? The kinds of people who join the Peace Corps want to be challenged. They don't want to sit on the sidelines when it comes to global issues. They are risk takers, they are resilient optimists, they're creative problem solvers, they embrace uncertainty, and they accept failure as an essential step towards growth. It is not for everyone, but the opportunity is profound, and those who sign up are truly fundamentally transformed. When I left for Peace Corps in Romania, I was going to give you the date. I believe, Chris, it is around the same time you served in Kyrgyz Republic. I will just say it was before the internet. Yes, that was a real time. It makes me feel very old. But I really did hear the world calling me to do something different, and I didn't know why or what. I served as a small business advisor in Romania, and that was shortly following the fall of communism, which was such a profound period in history, a time when you may have learned about in your history books, but it really was a time when the world order was shifting. And I feel like we are in a similar place right now following COVID, which was just such a tremendous shock to the global community, our global systems, and the way we think about how we engage with each other and across borders. So it was just a tremendous gift for me to work alongside Romanians to support their dreams for a new future in their budding democracy, which is something that I will never take for granted. I really learned not just to walk in someone else's shoes, but to walk alongside someone whose journey has been dramatically different from my own. I learned to question prevailing narratives, to challenge my own assumptions, and importantly, to be curious, because despite the beautiful differences in our rich cultures, we're all human at the end of the day. And we all have hopes and dreams, and we're all seeking understanding and to be understood. And I just have had so many aha moments throughout my journey with Peace Corps and in international development and working across cultures that have broadened my perspective in so many ways. And I think about, that girl in Kansas and the journey to Romania and where I am now. It really has challenged me every step of the way. And that's what I love about it. I don't want to go on too long, but, would like to note that, I moved from being a volunteer to being a country director in Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's a small country in southeastern Africa. And it is, as I said, one of the poorest economically, but a very, very rich and amazing culture. I loved my time there, learned so much. At that time, I did have a volunteer, Jane, who was 82 years old and had waited her entire life for an opportunity to serve in Peace Corps, as well as someone who was 20 and had, accelerated her college experience and joined. There was a volunteer from Montana, Donna. Hi, Donna, if you're out there right now. She was a health volunteer who did some great work around community health and malaria prevention. And she was, her fellow volunteers honored her with the most impactful project when they were closing up their service, where she did a big event on malaria prevention and taught people how to wash and mend their mosquito nets and to prevent malaria, which was one of the leading causes of death for children under 5. So I will stop there. I think, Chris, I have so much more that I would like to say about Peace Corps and our impact and where we're headed, but I do want to make sure we have time for some questions.
Well, we're definitely going to give you that chance, Carol, as we already have a number of questions coming in from the students at Bozeman High School. I'll just say to the other participants, please chat in your questions to Director Spahn. If you have them, I'll curate them and we go from there. And just reminding you, I think, Carol, that here at the University of Montana in Missoula, there is a Peace Corps Prep Certificate Program. So a number of the people on the call may be those students at who are involved in that. So let's hear from you all. And until then, here comes some questions from our students in Bozeman. How have the people you've met through Peace Corps impacted your life today?
Oh, there are so many stories. Let me talk about one of our staff members in Malawi. So Samson was a gardener. He had 6 kids. He did not make a lot of money. He had a very, very hard life. And I think about how I wake up every day and how I show up in the world every day. And I would be driving to work in Malawi and, with a grimace on my face, and, I had very serious, big problems, big challenges to address. And every single morning, Samson would be out sweeping the leaves off of the driveway, and he would greet me with the biggest smile. He would wave with both of his hands way up in the air and just like launch a good morning that lit up my morning every single time. And it was such a gift because it really forced me to ask myself, what is it that I think is so important that I am going to show up and be grumpy or grouchy or think that I need to be so serious. And that warmth and just hospitality pervaded every single aspect of life in Malawi, where people have very, very hard lives and they choose to show up for each other with a smile, a laugh, a story. They laugh with their whole bodies. They smile with their eyes. They really are just such amazing people, and it's such an amazing culture. And it really has challenged me to wake up every day and shake off that feeling and show up in the world in a different way for other people.
I'm yet to meet a returned Peace Corps volunteer who does not have a story like that. Some very deep and meaningful impact from the experience of being a volunteer that stays with you your entire life. Thanks for sharing that, Carol. The students would also like to know some more concrete examples of Peace Corps work.
Oh boy, there are so many. I will say the bulk of our volunteers, so about 50% of our volunteers teach English. English is the language of opportunity in many countries around the world. We just launched a new program in Vietnam, and they said, and we don't really think about this, but English is really the language of business. It's the language of the internet. It's the language of information. And so we are invited in to really teach English, but in a much broader way, we are learning and growing and teaching leadership skills. And a lot of volunteers have after school clubs with students that might be a club around women's empowerment or environmental issues, or it might be HIV prevention activities that they're doing as a secondary activity. So each volunteer is assigned to a primary project, and they're expected to work the bulk of their time on that. But there is a lot of room to bring in each volunteer's special gifts, be it art, dance, music, or any number of different things to their service. And really the reason I'm not being very, very specific is that volunteers are taught to do what's called a participatory assessment for community action. So they're taught the skills to go into a community and say, all right, let's look at what your needs are, and let's prioritize those, and let's work together on how we can make progress in, let's say, malaria prevention, or in things like planting trees and creating tree nurseries.
Carol, I'm going to pick up your point about training, but I'm going to give you some fair warning about we're getting a lot of great questions, but this is going to be a good one to wrap up our session with, which is, do you have any funny stories from your job? So don't answer that now. Let's wrap up, because anytime two volunteers get together, of course, we exchange funny stories. So hold on to that one. But I want to come back. You mentioned training. There is a question about language, and it's a very common question we've had this week. Peace Corps is very unique in its approach to training volunteers. And I would like you to maybe say a few words about the training, but also kind of, how that then prepares in full a Peace Corps volunteer to undertake their duties.
That is a great question. We take a lot of pride in our approach to language instruction and language training. And the theory behind that is really that, when you, and I'm going to, this quote, I haven't, learned who the right person is to attribute it to. These are not my words, but when you speak to someone in a language they understand, you speak to their head. When you speak to someone in their language, you speak to their heart. And it is such an important part of our work that we are integrating into communities. We are building that deep understanding and trust. So it's really an important part of our model, and we invest heavily in it. So during the first 3 months of service, volunteers get intensive language training. They're immersed, often at the community level, so that it's reinforced. They might be living with a host family that doesn't speak English, so you're forced to use that language. And often it's several hours a day of direct language instruction in small groups, 3 or 4 people, and really hands-on. So it's amazing what can be done in 3 months when you're immersed. And then usually there are options for tutoring throughout service. So some of our assignments come with a language requirement for some of the more common languages, and others don't, particularly where it's Wolof or Chichewa or a language that's not commonly spoken.
So in addition to that language training, volunteers get cultural training. They get some professional training as well to prepare them for ultimately their service, which again, it's very interesting and unique. And the reason I mention this, Carol, is that oftentimes questions from students kind of have a hint of it's kind of daunting to go out into the world. And that I think from my perspective, what's good to know about the Peace Corps is not only do you receive this very high quality training, but during your service, you're also supported by your Peace Corps country office. Could you talk a little bit about that support?
Absolutely. We've got a terrific infrastructure in every country, and every volunteer has a program manager who really works directly with their school or their community health center or their forestry officer, both to prepare the community to receive the volunteer, as well as to troubleshoot with the volunteers themselves. So there is always a lifeline that is there. And we really work to build the skills of the volunteers before they go out. Even the way that you cook or the way that you shop can be very different depending on where you are. And we address all of those things in addition to some of the cross-cultural skills, some of the things that might not be readily evident on their face, but might underlie some of the reactions that volunteers get. And I'll tell you a great story on the cultural side. There was a volunteer who was a teacher at a school, and she called her program manager and she said, I have been trying to work with my principal to really, get some of the, to get some projects going outside of the classroom. And, he's just not interested. And I can't figure out what I'm doing wrong. And as Americans, we typically like to have some very direct, do X, Y, or Z, to be able to get something done. And the program manager said to her, I want you to go and have tea with your head teacher every Sunday. And she was very confused and a little frustrated. And she went and had tea with her head teacher every Sunday, got to know him. They built a relationship, they built trust, and they suddenly started working together extraordinarily well. And, so it is stories like those that, sometimes the advice that you get doesn't feel like maybe what you want or what you might expect, because it's not linear. It really isn't a linear engagement. And I think that flexibility, that resilience, that awareness to come at problems and to look at opportunities from a lot of different perspectives is such a gift to people who are part of the Peace Corps.
I love that story because it also highlights a point that almost every one of our guests have made this week, which is the human element of the work. You know, connecting directly with others from other cultures, other countries, other backgrounds, values, what have you, and how important that is and how interesting that is. So thanks a lot for that's a great story to bring that out. Some more questions coming your way. Can the work of a Peace Corps volunteer be dangerous?
I think that let me start by saying that Peace Corps has a robust safety and security infrastructure, and we provide healthcare to our volunteers. The safety and security of our volunteers is our number one priority. That said, service does come with risk. Everything we do in this world, comes with different risks. And we do everything we can to mitigate those risks and to work, with volunteers along the way. Recently, if you're following the news, there has been some political unrest in Peru. We ended up evacuating our volunteers from Peru, temporarily to make sure that things are safe for them before they go back. So it is a very robust infrastructure that Peace Corps has built up to really take care of our volunteers.
Carol, could you talk a little bit about the selection process? So if somebody's interested in the Peace Corps, what do they need to do? What are their chances of getting into the Peace Corps, and what skills is the Peace Corps looking for?
Well, I would first of all advise anyone who is really interested in the Peace Corps to talk directly to a recruiter, and they can help look at your specific situation and your skill sets, your resume, and advise you on how you can really enhance that. We look for people who have some kind of cultural or cross-cultural engagement in their background, but if they don't, that they have an openness to learning, an openness and a curiosity about the world. You don't have to have been on study abroad or done anything like that, but we do look for people who are engaged in community service within their community or outside of their community. And we look for people who really are looking to engage with deep respect and with humility in cultures around the world.
Following my own service, Carol, I spent 20 years overseas working in different organizations, and I found during that time, any American I met in my work, there was about a 50% chance they were a former Peace Corps volunteer.
Yes.
So an interest, and by the way, a number of our guests this week are former Peace Corps volunteers. Carol, there is a certain aspect to Peace Corps that is the launch pad into other international careers. I wonder if you might share your views on that part of the Peace Corps.
It is absolutely the best launching pad you can get, full stop. And I hear that from United States Agency for International Development, where about 25% of their workforce is returned volunteers by our estimations. That's not a direct calculation. If you're interested in the State Department, about 10% of State Department, if not more, they're US direct hires. But almost every single international development agency has tremendous respect for the work that Peace Corps volunteers do and what the skills that volunteers learn by living in the community, at the community level, and how we engage. And it is, again, like the best thing you can have on your resume. And I will say, not only for international development jobs, for all kinds of jobs around the United States. I spoke with a recruiter for a high-tech biotech company, and he said he looks for Peace Corps volunteers. And I was a little confused by that. And he said, volunteers know how to be innovative, to be creative, to fail. It's an important thing to be able to know how to fail quickly, to redirect, and to move on. And he said, in high tech, that is what we need. We need people who can really have that awareness of what's happening. So as a global society, there are just so many skills that volunteers learn. I will also point out that volunteers do get what's called non-competitive eligibility for federal jobs up to a year after their service. And that means that certain positions they wouldn't need to compete for in the same way as someone who hadn't completed that service. And the other thing I will point out, Chris, is that every interview I've ever been in where someone always asks about my Peace Corps service. It is always a unique conversation point in an interview and an opportunity to connect with people in a different way than the other people who might be on the other side of that table.
No doubt about that, Carol. And I think for both of us, we've had this opportunity to be both a volunteer and then as a hiring manager looking at people. And I can tell you, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'd add simply that Peace Corps volunteers have a kind of stamp of proof of being able to do it under very difficult conditions. The toughest job you'll ever love, maybe one of the best taglines ever. It's timeless and continues with my service 30 years ago, your service and service today. I'll just mention quickly that I've dropped in the chat box the name of the University of Montana Peace Corps recruiter, new to the recruiter, Tenley Snow. The recruiter's email is in the chat box. If anybody wants to follow up, as Director Spahn said, get in touch with your recruiter, get more information, learn more about these opportunities. Okay, Carol, now it's time to wrap up. I have unfortunately shared my famous eating the sheep head story many times this week, and I'm not going to bore people with that again. So I'm going to go over to you and ask you for maybe a funny story, a humbling story, or anything you'd like to share to wrap up our session.
Wow, I wish I had that one in advance. This feels like one of those questions that I will think of 15 different amazing answers, once we hang up the line. There are so many humbling moments during Peace Corps that you just learn to laugh at yourself and laugh with others as those things come along. One of the more, I'll put it on the humiliating side, was in Romania. We were taught a lot of cross-cultural things, and volunteers don't make a lot of money. So we do tend to drive a hard bargain and to, really watch every lei is the name of the currency there, that comes and goes. And so we would go out to eat and order a meal. Often, it was right after the fall of communism. So there would be this big menu.
Carol, we've kind of lost you right now. Stand by. Let's see if it's coming back to us. Stand by, please.
Oh, darn.
Okay. Sorry. So you said you were at the restaurant.
Yeah. Okay. So we're at the restaurant and there's often a list of, 17 things on the menu. And, really only you ask for 4 or 5 of them before you ask what's available. And what was actually available, usually just a few things. And so you'd order, let's say, a pork steak, and you might say that you want French fries with that. And they would always bring salad and bread and all of these other things that they charged you for separately. And we spent probably a good 6 months arguing because we didn't want to pay for the salad and bread that we didn't order before we asked our host, staff, our host country staff. And they said, well, of course they bring that. Like, that's part of the meal. And you can't have a meal without bread. And you can't have a meal without salad. And, I just, to this day, it hurts me to think of all of those, waiters and waitresses and people that we were very self-righteously arguing with that they had done us a horrible wrong. And, it was just a cultural expectation. There are many more that I'm sure, again, I can come up with now, but that one popped to mind.
Well, that's a great story, Carol. And I'll tell you, we've had a number of stories from our guests. And I think for me, what they often underscore is the fact that, while it may seem a bit daunting to go out into the world to new cultures where, you may not know the language and the ways, but we all make mistakes and people are very understanding and forgiving. So don't let that be a barrier to your entry into an international career. In fact, that's one of the most interesting parts of working out there in the world. So, Director of the Peace Corps, Carol Spahn, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure. I'll thank very quickly the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, First Interstate Bank, Trail West Bank, QFI, a High Stakes Foundation, and the Longview Foundation. And once again, a very special thank you, Carol, for joining us.
Very happy to be here. And I'll leave you with my favorite quote that I left with the over 500 volunteers who came through Malawi. Life begins at the end of your comfort zone. So get out there and do things that make you really uncomfortable.
I love that. What a great way to wrap up. Thank you all for watching. We've got more to come. At 10:30, we've got our colleagues from the International Rescue Committee talking about working internationally with refugees, followed by Mary Poole of Soft Landing, Missoula. They run a nonprofit that is locally based, but looks internationally. And then we're wrapping up with round 2 of Photonics, Dean Stephanie Gray from Gallatin College. So please join us for those. And if you've not caught some of our great programs proceeding, check us out on YouTube. Carol Spahn, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Be well. Bye-bye.